Zuma's state visit to Kenya. We're now joined by the head of politics at UNISA, Professor Dirk Kotzé, who's in our Pretoria studios. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. What's your take on this historic visit President Zuma has undertaken to Kenya?
Well, this is certainly one of the most important visits of President Zuma to an African country for quite some time. Kenya is emerging as one of the main economies and leading countries in East Africa, and with the resurrection of the East African community, they are very important. From a security point of view, the fact that it is the neighboring countries of Somalia, Burundi and South Sudan, and that is also on the agenda for this discussion, so, and in which South Africa has also a very direct interest. For example, in the case of South Sudan, South Africa was very involved during the transition period after 2005 in order to do capacity building. At the same time, in the case of Burundi, President Zuma, through the African Union, has been also very much involved. And then in the case of Kenya, in relation to Somalia, it is very much part of the African Union's effort to deal with Islamic fundamentalism or terrorism, as if you want to call that, in that country. And therefore, Kenya plays a very important role on the East Coast from a South African point of view.
Well, it does seem then that there's more in this for Kenya than it is for South Africa.
No, I don't think so. Kenya is a very important trading partner for South Africa. South African exports to Kenya is more than 8 billion rand, which makes them one of the main trading partners. I think it's the fourth biggest trading partner in Africa for South Africa. There's more than 60 companies, South African companies, investing in Kenya also. Then in the past, we know that there was a lot of, for example, South African tourists going to Kenya. So there's quite a lot of exchanges that are taking place. With this state visit, a number of agreements have been signed now in the areas of military cooperation, of police cooperation, of customs cooperation, also with respect to visas, as we heard now. And also infrastructural development, the so-called Lamu, South Sudan, Ethiopian transport network that has been established, and South Africa has an interest in that also, especially with the export of oil. So there's lots of contact points between the two countries.
Kenya is also asking for some lifting of restrictions and reduction in levies with some of its products coming into South Africa. Are we in a position to assist them there?
Well, the trade balance is very much in favor of South Africa. As I said, it's about 8 billion rand of exports from South Africa to Kenya, while it's only about 360 million from Kenya to South Africa. So it's a very much an imbalanced situation. And therefore, South Africa can afford to improve the trade relations with Kenya without necessarily affecting the South African situation. These are many of them are products that are not produced in South Africa. So overall, it will be to the advantage of the South African economy also.
I'm also led to believe that Kenya is going to be asking President Zuma to assist with their nomination of the Foreign Affairs Cabinet Secretary, Amina Mohammed, to the chair of the African Union. Again, I suppose the more friends that they can get to back their nominee, the better. Did they help us when we put through Dr. Nkosazana Zuma?
Yes, in the end, the East African region did support South Africa candidate, Dr. Dlamini Zuma, not in the beginning, but later on. But I think the complication this time is that SADC has its own candidate from Botswana. So it's going to be a tough call for South Africa to decide which one of the two to support. But I guess the first loyalty for South Africa will be to the SADC candidate. But when there's an elimination round and, for example, the Southern African one, for example, falls out, then I guess the Kenyan one might become a possibility to support. But that's still in the future and will be part of the diplomatic deals that will be done between the different regions and individual countries.
Let's talk again a little bit about the security discussions. We know that terrorism is a challenge for East African nations. Kenya, as you said, because of their involvement in countries such as Somalia. How can South Africa assist and help and cooperate in a situation like that?
Well, the way in which I understand it is that South Africa can provide assistance in terms of military training and technical aspects of military issues, but not necessarily for South African troops to go to those countries. It appears to me that South Africa tries to keep away from hotspots where there's militant Muslim organizations involved, whether it is Al-Shabaab in Somalia or Boko Haram in Nigeria or in Mali and other countries. So it's unlikely that South African troops, for example, will join the Kenyan troops in the African Union peacekeeping force in Somalia. But at the other level, that of training, of technical assistance, together with others. And Kenya is known that it has also support from Western countries like the US and the British countries. And even, it's not very well known, from Israel. Israel is a very sort of presence within Kenya for many years already. Or take, for example, with the bomb explosions in 1998 in Nairobi. The Israeli assistance was the first that appeared on the scene. So these are the type of security aspects that one has to take into account. But Kenya is playing a very important role also because of its coastal presence, and South Africa is becoming, through measures like or programs like Operation Pakisa, much more involved in the maritime diplomacy. The piracy matter is something that South Africa is also becoming involved in. Kenya and Tanzania will play a very important role into secure the eastern coastal areas of those countries, and including Mozambique and South Africa.
Well, you've mentioned Tanzania and Kenya, and I'm just wondering, given the agreements that have been signed between South Africa and Kenya, will we likely see that flow to the other East African community countries, Tanzania, Uganda, maybe even Rwanda and Burundi?
Well, that is likely. South Africa, and especially during the time of President Mbeki, maintained a very close relationship with, especially Rwanda, President Kagame, but also with Uganda. This is more a new development now to go also into Kenya from a diplomatic point of view. So South Africa will definitely, in the case of Tanzania, there's a very old historical relationship between the liberation movements, the ANC and the PAC, in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam from the 1960s. So that historical relationship does already exist, which does not so much exist in the case of Kenya. So it is almost inevitable that it will spill over. One has to take also into account that not so long ago, the so-called tripartite alliance agreement was signed between SADC for Southern Africa, the East African Community for East Africa, and then COMESA to establish the free trade agreement that stretches almost from Egypt right down to South Africa. And in this arrangement, Kenya and Tanzania and Ethiopia and Egypt will play a very important role.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time this evening, Professor Dirk Kotzé from the Politics School at UNISA, speaking to us live from Pretoria.